So we're going to look today at that story that I read from Mark chapter 10. You'll also find a very similar story recounted in Matthew chapter 20 if you wish to have a look at that. There's some subtle differences, but much the same sort of idea. When we look at chapter 10 as a whole, we find a list of events and teachings of Jesus which the disciples consistently misunderstand. And indeed, as you look through the Gospel of Mark, this is a constant theme. The disciples consistently misunderstand what they see, they misunderstand what the Lord is saying. So, for example, in chapter 10, it opens with a story of the Lord speaking to the Pharisees, and the Pharisees are questioning the Lord about divorce. After that conversation takes place, the disciples take Jesus aside and question him over what he meant. Then there's the story of people bringing children to the Lord and the disciples, rebuking them and pushing them away. Jesus, on the other hand, says, no, let them come, and he blesses them. We have the story of the rich young ruler who approaches Jesus, and you remember the question, what should I do that I should inherit eternal life? And again, the disciples are astonished. They don't understand what Jesus is saying. And at one point, even Peter comes to the Lord, and he says, look, we've given up everything to follow you, as though he's having to prove himself to the Lord as a result of what they've seen in this conversation. Then we have this story that we read of Jesus and the disciples starting or moving towards Jerusalem. And Jesus tells them again about the arrest that's about to take place. And that seems to set off this conversation between the Lord and James and John. And of course we hear that the other disciples are not happy with James and John for making this request. This seems a bit of perhaps one-upmanship or something of that nature. If we read Matthew's version, in Matthew chapter 19, the chapter prior, Jesus has actually said that the disciples will sit on 12 thrones. And so James and John are merely jostling for position amongst the 12, as it were, if you look at it in that context. Now, what I find really interesting about this chapter is if you go backwards a step, go to chapter 9, there's actually a lot of parallels between chapter 9 and chapter 10, which I find quite curious. Chapter 9 begins with the transfiguration. And do you know the disciples who were present at the transfiguration? Well, Peter and James and John. It's curious that it's those three. As they come down the mountain, it turns out the other disciples have been confronted with a father has brought his boy to the disciples and said, look, he has an evil spirit. And the disciples have tried to get rid of this evil spirit, but they have failed. But again, past these stories, there's again the reference to the journey to Jerusalem. Jesus again tells the disciples why he's going to Jerusalem, what's going to happen. There's another question about greatness in the kingdom. The conversation of James and John with the Lord is not the first time that this has come up. In chapter 9, though, it's not the Lord involved. It's the disciples quarrelling amongst themselves who's going to be the greatest. And there's also the lesson and place of children. Because the Lord in chapter 9, addressing this problem, brings a child and says, look, if you're not like a little child, you're not going to be part of the kingdom. And if you look at chapters 9 and chapter 10 together, there's a common theme, a common thread that runs through them all. And it's essentially this from the last couple of verses that we read this morning. Whoever desires to become great among you shall be your servant. And whomever of you desires to be first shall be slave of all. That's the thread that runs through the two chapters. And something like that is said 3 times through these two chapters, 9 and 10. So when we then talk about the disciples' question, and we talk particularly about James and John coming to the Lord and making this request, there's a couple of things that I want us to note. First of all, I want to talk about the baptism that the Lord speaks of in his response. He says, "Are you able to be baptized with the baptism that I am going to receive?" And they respond affirmatively. But often when we talk about this particular part of the conversation, and we talk about this baptism, it's often assumed that it means Jesus' execution, that it's his being put to death for the faith. Because most of the disciples are indeed put to death for their faith later on in the story of the early church. The exception to that is John. And yet John has been asked this question, can you be baptized with the same baptism I will receive? And the Lord seems to say that John's going to face the same fate as the other disciples. But if that's execution, that's not true. Look, it's worth remembering when we talk about baptism, I talked about this several months ago, the word baptism is about a transformation. I don't know whether you remember, we talked about when they put a cucumber in vinegar, it's baptized in vinegar because of the transformation it brings about through that process. That's what baptism is about. So although John has not faced the same execution that the other disciples do, he has faced the same transformation. It is the same message of the gospel that has affected him as deeply as it affected any of the others. And the second question is really my theme for today, which is, why is this not something for the Lord to give? I want to go on to a different passage that we haven't read this morning, Revelation chapter 5. So this is part of the heavenly scene that John sees. You may know it if you read chapters 4 and 5. There's the kind of the heavenly throne room with the Lamb on the throne. There's elders, there's 4 creatures, there's a vast host. And this is part of a song that is sung by the elders and the 4 creatures. And just notice what it says at the end. And have made us kings and priests to our God, and we shall reign on the earth. Now, I just wanted to share with you what Swedenborg writes about this in particular, because I think it sheds some light on what we're talking about today. So he writes this: in the spiritual sense, kings mean truths, and priests good. Abstractly from persons, that is, the truths and goods that are in persons from the Lord. From which it follows that it is truths from good that are to reign. Thus the Lord alone from whom these are. Now he goes on to say, the angels indeed are in great power, but not one of them from himself. Yes, if anyone in heaven believes that he has power from himself, he is instantly deprived of it and then becomes wholly powerless. And he continues, it is said in the sense of the letter that these are to reign, because the sense of the letter is personal. But in the spiritual sense, everything of person is put off, and thus everything of dominion belonging to person, and dominion is left to the Lord alone. So when we look at those promises that are made in the Bible about reigning, about being on thrones, We are talking about principles that must reign within. And the only way in which any person actually does reign over anybody else is by virtue of the characteristics that they have present within their own life and which reign in them. So power is the Lord's alone, never ours. We only use it by virtue of the fact of what resides within us from the Lord. So when Jesus says that these places are not mine to give, they're for those for whom they are prepared. Well, who are they prepared for? You know, even in the world, you can't create a job for a person. It just falls apart every time. It's about the qualities within the person. So you conduct a job interview and you are seeking a set of qualities, qualifications, skills, etc. And it's those that make a person qualified for the job. So those positions on the left and right of the Lord are for those who have what is good and true in their lives. How does one develop those qualities of what is good and what is true? We've talked in a couple of previous services about spiritual laws. We talked about the law of attraction. We talked about the law of influx. One of the things that I realise as I consider those two laws is that they actually don't manifest any change in our lives. They simply mean that whatever is within me is what attracts what I experience. If I'm good, I attract what is good. If I'm evil, I attract what is evil. Evil carries its own punishment, good carries its own reward. And influx, the idea that what is within manifests what is without. These just are expressive of my being as I am, and they don't move me on. They don't change me. They don't move me from one state to another. But of course we know we don't begin our lives in a state of good. So what is it that moves us on? It's this equilibrium. Let me share a fairly lengthy passage with you about this equilibrium. Every single thing, celestial, spiritual, or natural, is balanced in such a way that nobody is able to think, feel, or act in isolation from the many, though each one supposes that he does so independently and in absolute freedom. Nothing in like manner ever exists that is not counterbalanced by its opposite, and things that are opposite by those that are intermediate. As a result, the individual by himself and the many collectively live in a most perfect equilibrium. Consequently, no evil can befall anyone without being instantly counterbalanced. And when there is a preponderance of evil, that is, the evildoer, is in that case corrected by the law of equilibrium as if of himself. But this never takes place except to the end that good may result. Such is the form, and therefore the equilibrium in which heavenly order consists, an order formed, arranged, and preserved forever by the Lord alone. Now look, we experience this equilibrium every day, and even in very natural ways. So for example, Pam and I have started a little exercise routine a couple of days a week. And I can tell you, as we get up to do our exercise routine, you have that feeling, oh, can't I just stay in bed? Or, can we go for a walk instead? We come up with this, I know that I need to do my exercises, but there's something that pulls me back. We experience this all the time. Can't I have this extra piece of cake? When we hear others speak as well, so often we hear what they have to say and we come up with a counterbalancing argument in our mind. Whether we say it or not, it comes up for us. And so we experience this equilibrium that takes place mentally and emotionally in our lives. And the same is happening in a spiritual way. We're presented with the choice. Will I do what I know I need to do and what I know is good for me and will move me forward? Or will I stay comfortable or even regress? I just want you to note at the end here how it says, it is an order formed, arranged and preserved forever by the Lord alone. It feels as though it's only us involved, but it is the Lord who arranges and maintains this balance. And this is how we are prepared for our place in heaven, wherever that might be. It really doesn't matter whether we end up on the left and the right side of the Lord. Perhaps somebody will, but that's not really the point. It's that the Lord provides us with the circumstances and the balance within which those principles of truth and goodness that matter are fostered and developed and nurtured within our lives. So what I want you to do in the week ahead is just consider the balance. Notice what happens in your own mind as you move about your day, as you interact with other people. Notice the way that your mind presents an opposite when that happens. Notice how your emotions and your desires present an opposite, and realize that it gives you a choice. There is the Lord giving you a choice and saying, which one matters to you? Which one are you going to confirm in your life?